Now, it's almost impossible to grasp the enormity of the violent events across the world this summer. History needs time in the blind spot of the rear-view mirror before we can see clearly what it is. In a moment, we'll discuss where the lessons of history take us with regards to Iraq and what seems to be the reluctance of the US and Britain to get involved again. But first, a reminder of how that past took shape. We're going to run two broadcasts made by US President George W. Bush and British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Both were delivered direct to the Iraqi people in April 2003, just after troops had been sent into Iraq. And it is the whole speech and nothing but the speech.
This is George W. Bush, the President of the United States. At this moment, the regime of Saddam Hussein is being removed from power, and a long era of fear and cruelty is ending. American and coalition forces are now operating inside Baghdad, and we will not stop until Saddam's corrupt gang is gone. The government of Iraq and the future of your country will soon belong to you. The goals of our coalition are clear and limited. We will end a brutal regime whose aggression and weapons of mass destruction make it a unique threat to the world. Coalition forces will help maintain law and order so that Iraqis can live in security. We will respect your great religious traditions, whose principles of equality and compassion are essential to Iraq's future. We will help you build a peaceful and representative government that protects the rights of all citizens. And then our military forces will leave. Iraq will go forward as a unified, independent, and sovereign nation that has regained a respected place in the world. The United States and its coalition partners respect the people of Iraq. We are taking unprecedented measures to spare the lives of innocent Iraqi citizens. We are beginning to deliver food and water and medicine to those in need. Our only enemy is Saddam and his brutal regime, and that regime is your enemy as well. In the new era that is coming to Iraq, your country will no longer be held captive to the will of a cruel dictator. You will be free to build a better life instead of building more palaces for Saddam and his sons, free to pursue economic prosperity without the hardship of economic sanctions, free to travel and free to speak your mind, free to join in the political affairs of Iraq. And all the people who make up your country, Kurds, Shia, Turkmens, Sunnis, and others, will be free of the terrible persecution that so many have endured. The nightmare that Saddam Hussein has brought to your nation will soon be over. You are a good and gifted people, the heirs of a great civilization that contributes to all humanity. You deserve better than tyranny and corruption and torture chambers. You deserve to live as free people, and I assure every citizen of Iraq, your nation will soon be free.
This is Tony Blair, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I'm glad to be able to speak to you today to tell you that Saddam Hussein's regime is collapsing, that the years of brutality, oppression, and fear are coming to an end, that a new and better future beckons for the people of Iraq. We did not want this war, but in refusing to give up his weapons of mass destruction, Saddam gave us no choice but to act. Now that the war has begun, it will be seen through to the end. We will continue to do all we can to avoid civilian casualties. Our enemy is Saddam and his regime, not the Iraqi people. Our forces are friends and liberators of the Iraqi people, not your conquerors. And they will not stay in Iraq a day longer than is necessary. I know, however, that some of you feared a repeat of 1991, when you thought Saddam's rule was being ended, but he stayed and you suffered. That will not happen this time. This regime will be gone and ended. And then we will work with you to build the peaceful, prosperous Iraq that you want and that you deserve. And this Iraq will not be run by Britain, or by the United States, or by the United Nations. It will be run by you, the people of Iraq. Our aim is to help alleviate immediate humanitarian suffering and to move as soon as possible to an interim authority that is run by Iraqis. That in turn will pave the way for a truly representative Iraqi government which respects human rights and the rule of law and spends Iraq's wealth not on palaces and weapons of mass destruction, but on you and the services you need. Saddam Hussein and his regime plundered your nation's wealth. While many of you live in poverty, they lived lives of luxury. Saddam became one of the richest men in the world, his money stolen from you, the Iraqi people. The money from Iraqi oil will be yours, to be used to build prosperity for you and your families. I know too, from my meetings with Iraqi exiles who live in Britain, that you are an inventive, creative people. You should be free to travel, free to have access to independent media, free to express your views, free to develop your culture. My experience of people the world over is that we all want to be able to live our lives in peace and in security. We all want to give our families the chance of a decent life and future. For years, that chance has been denied to you. Millions of your countrymen and women have been forced to leave. Many thousands have been murdered, tortured, brutalized by the regime. Now we want to give you the chance to rebuild your country, to rebuild your lives, to give your families a chance of that better future. So it is in the spirit of friendship and goodwill that we now offer our help. Thank you.
Tony Blair and George W. Bush, but you probably knew that. Here with me to discuss whether the backwash of regret is preventing bold and clear decisions being made now are John Rentoul, journalist, writer and a confirmed Blairite, and Peter Hitchens, journalist, writer and not a confirmed Blairite. John, can I start with you? Watching those speeches now, what do they make you think?
Well, they make me feel very sad because, you know, the hopes that people had at the time proved to be so awfully badly founded, and you know, you can't say anything other than, you know, the present state of Iraq is a disaster. And
but would you still say that Tony Blair and George Bush's policy was right, or are you one of those people who say it was completely wrong and they've caused what's happening in Iraq?
Well,
now?
of course not. No, I mean, it wasn't completely wrong at all. I mean, the aims of the policy were good and noble, and it turned out extremely badly. I mean, I think the worst lesson to take away from Iraq would be Peter's lesson, which is that intervention never works. Sometimes it works, and in Iraq it really didn't. But we have a responsibility, I think, partly because we helped to create the mess that Iraq has now, to finish the job.
Peter Hitchens, you've been slightly preempted there. We know now what your strategy is, but I'd like to ask you the same question, actually, just your reaction to seeing all those words again. What do they make you feel?
Well, one of the things that make me feel is the vainglorious self-regard of these incredibly ignorant, uninstructed people who launched themselves into a problem they didn't understand, and who thereby created a mess far worse than the one they claimed they were going to be clearing up. It seems to me to be a fairly good warning to almost all politicians that things are actually more complicated than they seem. Since most of these people can't run their own countries with any great competence, it strikes me as wise they should steer clear of trying to run other people's, and that lesson wouldn't be a bad one to take from it. John Rentoul says that I say you should never intervene. I wouldn't go quite that far. There may be circumstances when it might be a good idea.
Is one
but
of
in
those
general,
circumstances appearing now
it
with
would
the
help.
threat of ISIS?
It would help before you intervened if you knew what you were doing. Not only did they not know what they were doing, they rejected the advice of people who did.
Okay, but how can you ever really know what you're doing?
Well,
because you cannot imagine that in 2003 somebody could have sat down, no matter how clever they were, and possibly no matter how much history they'd read, that a force like IS would be marauding its way across the country, killing people in the morning in order to try and get to their heaven in the afternoon.
Well, actually, the history of Iraq is ever since we created it, has been one of violence, coup d'etat, and all kinds of terrible mayhem, much of which was directed against we, the British, when we first went there. And if anybody had known that, they would have realized it was more of a problem than they thought. I don't think a lot of these people even understood the nature of the division between Sunni and Shia, for instance, let alone the problems with Kurdistan. Now, one of the things they've actually achieved is to turn one country into three, only we still have to pretend that it's one. And the other thing, which I think has to be rammed home again and again, is they said they were going to bring democracy to Iraq. Well, actually, a collaboration between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran has just overthrown the democratically elected government of Iraq and replaced it with one more to its taste. That's not democracy.
Well,
whatever else it may or may not be, it is not
John.
Democratic.
No, but that's obviously a gross simplification of.
It's not a gross. It's an
happened.
absolutely straightforward statement of the case.
No, I think everyone would agree that that Maliki was part of the problem in dealing with ISIS, and that the pressure on him from within Iraq was to have him.
Yes, but the question: if you set yourself up as bringing democracy to a country, and you then collaborate with Iran in overthrowing the democratically chosen leader of that country, you can no longer claim to be the apostle of democracy. Whatever else you claim to be doing, you can't do that.
Yeah. Can I just ask you both this question, though, about the shadows of history? Because so many people believe that the reluctance on the part of the US and Britain to actually go in is based on the fact that the last two campaigns have been very unsuccessful. But are we deluding? Sorry, the Gulf Wars. Are we deluding ourselves and allowing history to kind of skew the present? Because the situation now is very different. I mean, the humanitarian disaster that we're seeing, the potential genocides, it is a different situation now. We aren't talking about just a rerun of what happened before.
No, but and again, it would be foolish to ignore any possibility of saving people from genocide or saving them from starvation or all the other terrible things that happen.
We're making progress.
To be very, very careful. Well, no, that's what I've always thought. You have
so
to
this
be
is one of those
very
cases
careful
where
very careful not to extend that, which it could very easily happen, into something much bigger. Almost all these operations begin. The Libyan catastrophe began with claims that we were going to prevent a massacre.
Well,
Libya is now one big massacre.
Sure.
And
No,
nobody reports it because nobody dares go there. We didn't
let
prevent one, we created
No,
one.
Peter,
Mr.
no,
Hitchens,
we
let
did.
John reply,
we
please.
did prevent the coalition
Hypothetical.
prevented a massacre in Libya. There's no question about that. It too has not turned out very well through.
No.
But the causes of that are deep and various, and not necessarily to do with the intervention. Just as the causes of ISIS are not necessarily to do with the intervention of 2003, they're much more to do with our failure to intervene in Syria, which created
on the contrary,
ISIS.
ISIS is largely a consequence of our destabilization of Syria.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time. We could have talked all night about it, I know. Thank you very much.